Today we'll be talking about the many different amendments and the effects it had, the obstacles it had to overcome. And the amendments that we'll be talking about are going to be the 16, the 17, 18, 19, 22nd, and 26th Amendment. We'll begin with the 16th Amendment. It allowed Congress the right to collect tax on income from whatever source derived from, whether it be the rich people or the poor people. Why was it needed? It was needed to repay the debt the federal government was in at that moment, because at that moment, I believe they had just finished concluding the Civil War, and since the country didn't, they just decided the only way they had to repay the debt was by taxing the people. What were the type of people participating in this amendment? It was mostly the not wealthy people, or just people who thought rich people paying less taxes and poor people was wrong. Some of the people were Cordell Hull, a Democratic congressman, Republican President William Taft, the public, since most of them weren't wealthy, and the newspaper was also biased towards them. Some of the obstacles they faced in passing this amendment, it was Franklin D. Roosevelt, Secretary of State, put together a coalition of progressive Democrats and Republicans. They tried to attach income tax bills to tariff legislations, making it more difficult to pass, therefore making the amendment that much harder to pass. Another obstacle was that the amendment had to pass through both houses of Congress by 2/3 majority, and 3/4 of state legislatures would, in order to ratify it. What was the time it took to ratify the amendment? It took about 4 years. What was the overall impact of this amendment? The biggest effect it had was it shifted the power between the balance of power towards the federal government away from the states. The next amendment we'll be talking about, the 17th Amendment. It said it designates the election process rather than appoint for senators. Why was the amendment needed? It was needed in order to elect for senators, or the different people or groups of people working towards this amendment. It's mostly the U.S. House of Representatives. What were the obstacles faced in passing the 17th Amendment? The Senate refused to even take a vote on this matter, therefore making passing this amendment that much harder. What was the time it took to ratify this amendment? It took about 11 months to ratify this amendment. What was the overall impact of this amendment? It just stated that senators would be elected by state legislatures. Next amendment is the 18th Amendment. What it did, it prohibited manufacturing and selling and distributing alcohol beverages. What was the historical background on why the amendment was needed? At that point, alcohol was having many negative effects on America's people. It was making the poor people poor, because they would earn their money and they would just spend it on beer, which then led to America's prisons being filled up more. So it was just negative effects over negative effects. What were the different people or groups of people working towards trying to pass this amendment? It was a Women's Christian Temperance Union, Anti-Saloon League, was just it was a league that was just anti-alcohol. Carrie Amelia Moore Nation, and quote-unquote dry members, which were just another group of people just being anti-alcohol beverages. What are some of the obstacles faced in passing this amendment? There were actually not that many obstacles when trying to pass this amendment. Well, how long did it take to ratify this amendment? It took about 2 years. What was the overall impact of this amendment? The sad thing was that it didn't have that much of an impact. The reason why this was the reason why was because The 18th Amendment stated that the just the selling and manufacturing and distributing was illegal, but the actual drinking of beer wasn't. So this just it was almost like a loophole. So like people were just they were still finding ways of selling and drinking beer. The next amendment is the 19th Amendment. What it did, it was it allowed women to vote. What was the historical background on why the amendment was needed? It was needed just to have more of an equality between a female and a male, or a woman or a man. Doesn't matter. What were some of the different people trying to work towards the amendment? It was mostly like women, woman right, like just people who wanted women to vote, which were mostly women. Some of these people were Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, and Susan B. Anthony. What were some of the obstacles faced in passing this amendment? Since most of the government was male, it made that like the amendment that much harder to pass, because most of the men, or actually all the government was men, so it just made it really hard to pass. The reason why was because women were thought less than a man. There were many anti-suffragists, which meant just like anti-women rights. They believed women were high-strung, irrational, emotional women, were not smart nor educated enough to vote, and they should stay at home, and like they were too physically frail and whatever. What was the time it took to ratify the amendment? It took about 8 days. And what was the overall impact of this amendment? The overall impact, it made women more equal to men. The next amendment is the 22nd Amendment. What it did, it put limit on the number of terms a president may serve to 2 terms. What was the historical background on why the amendment was needed? It was needed because after Franklin D. Roosevelt died in 1945, by the time he died, he had almost served 4 terms, and people just believed that there should be a limit to how many serves a president could have. Because they believed that any American president that served more than 8 years, it was just bad for the country. What were the different type of people just trying to pass this amendment? It was just your like average person or your average American. Just they all decided that a president should have a limit to how long they could stay in office. What were some of the obstacles faced in passing the amendment? There have been there was many like repeated attempts to repeal the 22nd Amendment. Some which included President Reagan also stating his intention to fight for the amendment's repeal. They believe that the president shouldn't have a limit to how long they should serve. How long did it take to ratify this amendment? It took about 4 years. What was the overall impact of this amendment? All it really did, it was just limited the amount of terms a president could serve. The final amendment is the 26th Amendment. What it did, it just lowered the voting age to 18. What was the historical background on why the amendment was needed? It was just, this goes kind of to with what the type of people or groups of people working towards the amendment. At that point, when this amendment was being passed or did pass, it was around World War II, I believe. So many people were being drafted to the army. As soon as you were 18, you were eligible to be drafted to the army. So people believe many of the young people there being drafted stood by a common slogan, which was "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," which stated that if I'm old enough to go to war, I should be old enough to vote. What were some of the obstacles faced in passing this amendment? Congress, many people believe Congress did not have the right to regulate the minimum age in state and local elections, only in federal elections. What was the time it took to ratify this amendment? It took about 3 months and 8 days. And what was the overall impact of this amendment? Just the impact they had, just it made younger people allowed to vote.